Hi there. So here I am on Saturday, and I gave my presentation to everyone. I'm on the other side. Um, it was interesting. The most interesting thing to me was that our schedule had changed, and both the panel chair and myself ended up in the studio that we were supposed to be having our session in, and other people were there. It was for a female Gothic fiction session, and apparently they bumped us to the next session afterwards, same room. So there was a little bit of a panic, but I decided just to hang in that room and listen to the speakers who were talking about the female Gothic. I actually had some interesting questions for them afterwards because there are a lot of statements about womanhood and femininity and vulnerability and stuff like that. And the big white elephant missing in the room was exactly that, whiteness. And so I asked the panel, how can we pose these questions as particular to the female Gothic if we're only referring to white writers? And more to the point, even if we do, such as Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, how is womanhood defined if we don't make reference to whiteness? When you have to think about the mad woman in the attic, Bertha, and she's a Creole woman, enslaved, Mrs. Rochester, banished, kept away, dehumanized. And how does that stand in relation to Jane Eyre and her aspirations? One of the speakers said, well, as women, they're on a par. And I thought, well, that's not really an adequate answer. But all the audience was white. The panel, all of them were white. And it just seemed really ironic because we're in New Orleans. And this is the place of the Gothic. And there are so many African American women writers of the Gothic, not necessarily particular to New Orleans, but you can think about Toni Morrison's Beloved, right? And you can also make reference to Octavia E. Butler. But it seems like that's not part of the conversation. It was acknowledged that there's a very European or Eurocentric kind of emphasis. But I was kind of taken aback that that wasn't named as such, especially in these times. Assertions about womanhood and what womanhood is without thinking about the racial contours and also denials of womanhood through processes of demonization and also like dehumanization, including historically in this very country of black women. So anyway, I was that other quote unquote white person in the room with a different kind of sensibility who asked that question. And everyone looked at me when, when I asked that question. And the panel chair was like, that is such a good question. And it's true. Anyway, I'm finding it a little bit like that, although there were, in a session that featured a speaker talking about Kim Petras's Slut Pop, a few black audience members, and they managed to ask these sorts of questions as well, and I chimed in with another question and we exchanged notes. So you got to find your people, right? I mean, I just kind of don't relate to the big array of Beckys. I know that's a very withering term, and I know a lot of people wouldn't like that and they would consider it to be sexist. But how can you talk about patriarchy without talking about racism and coloniality and that whole history that I'm making reference to, you know? In any genre. I'm just stunned by the whiteness of so many of the panels. Not many people came to ours. So it's very interesting, right? Because the female Gothic was so full. the studio was to the brim, and then everyone vacated, and apparently Latino tracks will only draw in a handful of Latinos and Latinas. So that was a little bit disappointing, but I'm familiar with this. Notably absent is any kind of indigenous perspective in any of the panels. I mean, I'm going to look later, but I don't see it. I don't. And I also don't see people emplacing themselves, right? I made an attempt to do that yesterday, and I think my talk went pretty well. Certainly people engaged with it, and there was one white audience member, a man. They seemed to enjoy it, so, you know, at the very least it gave that value. Yeah, so all in all, a long way to travel to have minimal engagement, but that even happens with LASA, with the Latin American Studies Association conferences, which I've stopped going to. These big mega conferences, it's hard to make connections sometimes, notwithstanding some of the stated intentions, and also they're really expensive and no food is provided, nothing like that. It's a bit overwhelming for that reason. But anyway, this is the last day, and tomorrow I'll be shifting from where I'm at now, which is mid-city, down to an area that's kind of closer to the French Quarter, and it's where my friend lives. So I'm going to be spending the remainder of my time until the 24th being in New Orleans, having a different set of experiences, which I'm really hungering for, as well as not having to pay so much for accommodation, because they very kindly have offered me their guest room. And so this is an old friend, right, that I lived with and hung with when he was living in Melbourne. So that's really good news, and I'm looking forward to it. I got to get my shit together. I had a really good quality coffee, well, 2 actually earlier, but that was on the back of a really good sleep, because I've been really tired, and after giving my presentation I was definitely tired. Yeah, I was just shattered, because these things take energy. Right now I've got to pack and move to another room, but before I vacate I'll eat my leftovers to do something about them, because it's a bit awkward. Yeah, but anyway, I hope you all have a good Easter. More updates as they happen.